President Bush was supposed to return to Washington immediately after the 9/11 attacks, but Air Force One didn't land at the White House for another 13 hours. Why couldn't the president fly home? The answer involves miscommunications, security threats, and split-second decisions that have only recently been declassified. Fresh Secret Service agent logs and cockpit voice recordings now reveal the untold story of how America's Flying Command Center became a target itself, and how the people aboard fought to keep the president and the country safe. What began as a routine morning in Florida would become the longest presidential flight in modern history, testing every protocol designed to protect American democracy. The morning that changed everything. At exactly 9:05 a.m. on September 11th, 2001, President Bush sits in a second-grade classroom at Emma E's Booker Elementary School, listening to children read from The Pet Goat. The morning had started as routine as any other presidential visit to promote education initiatives. Chief of Staff Andy Card enters the classroom and approaches the president from behind. Card leans down and whispers 7 words that would change everything. A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. Bush's face remains composed, but his mind races through possibilities. The initial plan seems straightforward. Finish the school event quickly, make a brief statement, and return to Washington within 2 hours. Secret Service agents, positioned around the classroom, immediately spring into action, their earpieces crackling with urgent communications. Newly released 2025 documents reveal the flood of radio chatter between agents in those crucial minutes. Agent Richard Keene reports receiving contradictory intelligence about potential targets, while Agent Carl Truscott confirms that Air Force One is being prepared for immediate departure. The confusion spreads beyond the classroom walls. Communications between the Secret Service detail, the White House Situation Room, and Air Force One's advanced team reveal a system struggling to process multiple simultaneous threats. Agent logs declassified in 2025 show that within minutes of Card's whisper, agents were receiving reports of additional hijacked aircraft still in the air. Early reports wildly varied, from 3 to a dozen hijacked planes, reflecting the chaos of those first minutes. Bush finishes listening to the children read, knowing that any sudden departure would create panic in a room full of second graders and teachers. But Secret Service protocols demand immediate evacuation. The president's protection detail faces an unprecedented situation. They must balance the optics of presidential leadership with the stark reality that their primary responsibility is keeping Bush alive. Agent in charge Eddie Marenzel makes the call to begin moving toward the school's exit, but the process must appear calm and controlled. The September 11th attacks would later spur the creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002, fundamentally changing how America handles crisis response. But in 2001, existing protocols seemed inadequate for the current threat. The 7-minute delay in the classroom, while politically sensitive, created security risks that would later be addressed in updated procedures. The key players who would shape the next 13 hours begin converging on Air Force One. Colonel Mark Tillman, the aircraft's pilot, receives his first indication that this will not be a routine flight to Washington. Flight engineer Master Sergeant Paul Gibbs starts reviewing emergency protocols that haven't been used since the Cold War. Communications Specialist Technical Sergeant Thomas Gould begins establishing secure links with the Pentagon and White House, but the systems immediately show strain under the unprecedented demand for simultaneous connections. Multiple erroneous threats to government sites fueled the fog of war, with agents receiving false reports about car bombs and attacks on various federal facilities. The challenge facing the Secret Service becomes clear. They must protect the president without knowing the scope of the threat. Agent Marenzel's radio crackles with updates every few seconds, but the information contradicts itself. One report suggests all aircraft have been grounded, while another warns that hijacked planes remain airborne. Bush's motorcade forms outside the school, but the route to Sarasota-Bradenton International Airport suddenly seems fraught with risk. The original plan called for a direct 15-minute drive, but agents now worry about potential threats along the route. 2025 security analysis shows that the motorcade's path was altered 3 times during the journey to the airport, each change based on new intelligence about possible threats that later proved unfounded. Air Force One sits on the tarmac, its engines already running. The Boeing 747-200B has been modified with the most advanced communication equipment available in 2001, but those systems were designed for Cold War scenarios involving nuclear threats, not hijacked commercial aircraft used as weapons. The aircraft's defensive capabilities include electronic countermeasures and flare dispensers, but nothing to protect against a coordinated ramming attack by multiple aircraft. Captain Tillman faces a unique challenge. His training covers scenarios involving hostile foreign aircraft and surface-to-air missiles, but the threat profile for September 11th doesn't match any existing playbook. The Federal Aviation Administration has grounded all civilian air traffic, creating an unprecedented situation where any aircraft in the sky could potentially be hostile. The normal air traffic control system that Air Force One relies on for coordination has essentially collapsed under the weight of the crisis. The first signs that this would not be a normal flight emerged during pre-flight preparations. Typically, Air Force One's flight plan would be filed and approved through standard channels. But with the FAA grounding all aircraft and reports of multiple hijackings, the normal rules no longer apply. Tillman receives instructions to prepare for an immediate departure with destination to be determined en route. Secret Service protocols designed during the post-Cold War era suddenly seem inadequate for the current threat. The existing procedures assume that threats to the president come from foreign adversaries with conventional weapons. The idea that domestic commercial aircraft could be turned into guided missiles wasn't part of any security assessment. Agent training focused on protecting against shooters, bombers, and foreign agents, not hijacked airliners controlled by terrorists. At 9:54 a.m., President Bush boards Air Force One through the aircraft's rear entrance, avoiding the traditional front steps that would make him visible to potential threats. The Secret Service detail that boards with him includes agents who have never faced a real-world crisis of this magnitude. Their training scenarios involved isolated threats, not a coordinated attack on multiple fronts with unknown additional targets. As the aircraft prepares for departure, the crew remains unaware that their biggest challenge isn't getting airborne. It's what they'll discover waiting for them on the runway. The mysterious runway threat. Colonel Mark Tillman receives an urgent radio transmission from the control tower as Air Force One sits ready for departure. A suspicious individual has been spotted near the runway perimeter, carrying what appears to be an unidentified device. The report sends immediate alarm through the Secret Service detail aboard the aircraft. Agent Eddie Marenzel processes the transmission and makes an instant threat assessment. With multiple hijacked aircraft still unaccounted for and the president aboard, any unknown person near the runway represents a potential danger. The device in the individual's hands could be anything from a camera to a weapon capable of targeting the presidential aircraft. Marenzel immediately radios the cockpit with instructions that will alter their departure plans entirely. Tillman faces a decision no Air Force One pilot has ever confronted. Standard protocol calls for immediate takeoff once the president boards, but the security threat near the runway creates an unacceptable risk. The aircraft's current position places them directly in the line of sight of the suspicious individual. Tillman makes an unprecedented choice. He will taxi Air Force One to the opposite end of the runway, adding precious minutes to their departure, but potentially avoiding catastrophe. The massive Boeing 747 begins its slow journey across the tarmac, its 4 engines creating a thunderous roar that masks the tension inside the cabin. Secret Service agents position themselves throughout the aircraft, deploying in the aisles with their eyes scanning every window for potential threats. Agent Carl Truscott stations himself near the cockpit door, while other agents take defensive positions throughout the passenger compartments. The atmosphere aboard Air Force One transforms from routine travel preparation to combat readiness. President Bush, seated in his private cabin, receives updates about the delay, but remains calm. His staff, however, grows increasingly anxious as precious minutes tick by. Press Secretary Ari Fleischer continues taking his handwritten notes, documenting every development in real time. The delay stretches on as Air Force One crawls across the runway, its massive frame presenting a slow-moving target for anyone with hostile intentions. The taxi operation takes nearly 8 minutes to complete, an eternity when every second could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. During this time, Air Force One remains essentially defenseless against any ground-based attack. The aircraft's sophisticated defensive systems are designed for airborne threats, not individuals with weapons positioned near runways. The Secret Service agents know they are protecting the president while he sits in what amounts to a stationary target. Communications between the aircraft and ground control reveal the heightened state of alert gripping everyone involved. Every radio transmission carries urgency as controllers coordinate with security personnel to assess the threat. The normal protocols for presidential departures have been abandoned in favor of emergency procedures that prioritize security over efficiency. Ground crews scramble to identify the suspicious individual, while Air Force One continues its slow progress to the far end of the runway. The psychological impact of this delay affects everyone aboard differently. Secret Service agents maintain their professional composure while internally calculating threat assessments and response options. Presidential staff members struggle with the realization that even America's most secure facilities cannot guarantee safety. The illusion of invulnerability that surrounds presidential travel has been shattered within hours of the morning's attacks. Colonel Tillman finally receives clearance for takeoff from the runway's far end, but his challenges are just beginning. Standard Air Force One departures follow gradual climb patterns designed for passenger comfort and fuel efficiency. However, the current threat environment demands a defensive departure that prioritizes getting the aircraft out of range of potential ground-based weapons as quickly as possible. Tillman prepares for a steep-angle takeoff that will test both the aircraft's capabilities and the nerves of everyone aboard. The Boeing 747's engines roar to full power as Tillman releases the brakes and begins the takeoff roll. Air Force One accelerates down the runway at maximum speed, its massive frame gathering momentum for the unusual departure ahead. Passengers and crew brace themselves as the aircraft lifts off at a much steeper angle than normal, climbing rapidly to escape the vulnerable airspace near the ground. The defensive maneuver succeeds in getting the presidential aircraft airborne quickly, but it serves as a stark reminder that normal procedures no longer apply. As Air Force One climbs toward cruising altitude, updated incident reports arrive from ground security teams. The 2025 declassified documents reveal the truth about the suspicious individual who caused the 8-minute delay. The person carrying the unidentified device was actually a photographer attempting to capture images of the presidential departure. The device that appeared threatening from a distance was simply a camera with a telephoto lens. The miscommunication between security personnel and the control tower had created a false alarm that forced the unprecedented runway change. This revelation highlights critical gaps in ground security coordination that existed in 2001. The communication systems designed to protect Air Force One had failed to quickly identify and verify the nature of the threat near the runway. Multiple agencies were involved in the assessment, but their coordination proved inadequate for the rapid threat verification required during a national emergency. The photographer incident became a case study in how miscommunication could create dangerous delays during crisis situations. The lessons learned from this 8-minute delay led to comprehensive changes in runway security protocols that remain in effect today. Modern 2025 airport security measures include enhanced perimeter monitoring systems that can immediately identify and assess potential threats. Advanced communication networks now connect all security personnel in real time, allowing for instant verification of suspicious activities. These improvements ensure that Air Force One can depart quickly without unnecessary delays caused by misidentified threats. As Air Force One finally reaches cruising altitude, the relief aboard proves temporary. The steep climb has carried them away from a false alarm on the ground, but now they face an even greater challenge. The aircraft climbs into airspace where the rules of engagement have fundamentally changed and where any aircraft could potentially represent a threat. Flying blind in hostile skies, Colonel Mark Tillman receives updated intelligence that chills everyone in the cockpit. At least 4 commercial aircraft remain hijacked and their locations are unknown. The Federal Aviation Administration has grounded every civilian plane in American airspace, but several aircraft have simply vanished from radar screens. Any plane still flying could be controlled by terrorists intent on using it as a weapon against Air Force One itself. The decision to climb to 45,000 feet comes directly from Secret Service protocols designed for exactly this scenario. At this height, Air Force One operates in airspace typically reserved for military aircraft, well above the 30,000 to 37,000 feet, where commercial aircraft normally cruise. The extreme altitude provides a buffer zone against potential attacks from hijacked commercial aircraft that might still be airborne. Communications networks nationwide buckle under the unprecedented demand, hindering real-time updates to Air Force One. Technical Sergeant Thomas Gould struggles with radio systems experiencing significant interference at the extreme altitude. Voice transmissions break up into static bursts, and data connections drop repeatedly. The secure communication links connecting Air Force One to the White House Situation Room begin failing at critical moments, leaving the aircraft effectively isolated during some of the most dangerous minutes of the flight. The Federal Aviation Administration's command center in Herndon, Virginia reports a terrifying reality to Air Force One's crew. Air traffic controllers have lost positive radar contact with multiple aircraft across the eastern United States. Flight 93 disappeared from screens over Pennsylvania. American 77 vanished somewhere near the Ohio-Kentucky border before reappearing on approach to Washington. Controllers estimate that between 6 and 11 aircraft remain unaccounted for, though these numbers change every few minutes as conflicting reports flood in from different radar facilities. Master Sergeant Paul Gibbs monitors the aircraft's defensive systems from his position in the communications compartment. The Boeing 747-200 carries sophisticated electronic countermeasures designed to defeat surface-to-air missiles and hostile radar systems. Chaff dispensers can create false targets to confuse incoming missiles, while infrared flares provide defense against heat-seeking weapons. However, these systems offer no protection against the new threat profile, commercial aircraft being used as guided missiles by human pilots. The radar screen in Air Force One's communications center displays a constantly changing picture of aerial activity across the southeastern United States. Military aircraft appear as friendly symbols, but several unidentified contacts move through restricted airspace without proper authorization. Each unknown radar return represents a potential threat that could be approaching at 500 miles per hour. The crew watches these contacts with growing tension, knowing that any aircraft deviating toward their flight path could force immediate evasive action. Air Force One's isolation becomes more pronounced as communication systems fail at critical moments. During a scheduled check-in with the White House at 10:15 a.m., the secure voice link cuts out completely for nearly 4 minutes. Gould frantically cycles through backup frequencies while Colonel Tillman maintains radio silence to avoid revealing their position to potential threats. The communication blackout leaves Air Force One effectively cut off from ground control during some of the most dangerous minutes of the flight. Fighter aircraft had been scrambled earlier that morning, but coordination failures left Air Force One unprotected during its most vulnerable phase. Otis Air National Guard Base launched F-15 Eagles at 8:53 a.m., followed by F-16s from Langley Air Force Base at 9:30 a.m., but all arrived too late to intercept the hijacked aircraft that struck their targets. For nearly 30 minutes after takeoff from Sarasota, Air Force One flies alone through potentially hostile airspace without any armed protection. The psychological pressure inside Air Force One's cockpit intensifies as Tillman and his co-pilot Lieutenant Colonel Mark Donnelly navigate through airspace where normal rules no longer apply. Their training covers scenarios involving foreign military threats and surface-to-air missiles, but nothing prepared them for tracking multiple hijacked civilian aircraft that could approach from any direction. Every radar contact requires immediate assessment. Friendly military aircraft, hijacked civilian plane, or unknown threat that could be targeting the president. Deputy Chief of Staff Josh Bolton joins other senior staff members in monitoring radar displays from a passenger cabin. The screens show a confusing mixture of military and civilian aircraft moving through airspace that should be completely clear. Each unidentified contact triggers discussions about potential evasive maneuvers, but changing course could take Air Force One into the path of other unknown aircraft. The staff realizes they are flying blind through a three-dimensional battlefield where threats can appear from any direction. Air traffic control facilities across the country report system overloads as they attempt to track aircraft that have stopped responding to radio calls. The normal separation procedures that keep civilian aircraft safely apart have collapsed, creating potential collision hazards throughout American airspace. Controllers work frantically to identify which aircraft are still under pilot control versus those that have been hijacked, but the distinction becomes impossible to make through radar alone. The tension aboard the aircraft reaches its peak when radar operators detect two fast-moving contacts approaching from the northeast. The aircraft appear to be traveling at high speed toward Air Force One's general vicinity, but their identity remains unknown for several critical minutes. Secret Service agents prepare for potential evasive action while communications specialists attempt to establish radio contact with the approaching aircraft. The possibility that hostile planes have located Air Force One creates the most dangerous moment since takeoff. At 10:42 a.m., the approaching radar contacts finally identify themselves as United States Air Force F-16 Fighting Falcons from the 125th Fighter Wing of the Florida Air National Guard. The fighter aircraft establish visual contact with Air Force One and take up escort positions on both sides of the presidential aircraft. For the first time since leaving Sarasota, Air Force One has armed protection against potential aerial threats. The sight of the F-16s provides immediate psychological relief to everyone aboard, but the president's desire to return immediately to Washington is about to create an unprecedented confrontation with his own security detail, the Secret Service rebellion. At 10:45 a.m., President Bush sits in his private cabin aboard Air Force One and makes what should be a simple presidential decision. He wants to return to Washington immediately to address the nation from the Oval Office. The American people need to see their president in the White House during this crisis, not hiding in an airplane at 45,000 feet. Bush summons Agent Eddie Marenzel to his cabin and expresses his clear preference to return home to Washington. The Secret Service response creates an unprecedented moment in modern presidential protection. Declassified radio logs from 2025 reveal Agent Marenzel's recorded transmission to the Secret Service Command Center, recommend immediate diversion to secure military facility. Washington threat level remains critical. The agents have received intelligence reports suggesting additional attacks may be targeting the Capitol, making the president's preferred destination appear extremely dangerous. Intelligence reports flooding into the Secret Service paint Washington as an active target zone. The Pentagon has been hit. The White House has received bomb threats. Reports suggest that multiple government buildings remain targets for coordinated strikes. From the Secret Service perspective, returning the president to Washington would be delivering him directly into the hands of terrorists who have already demonstrated their ability to strike at the heart of American government. Deputy Chief of Staff Josh Bolton joins the discussion in Bush's cabin as the situation grows more tense. The president argues that his place is in Washington leading the nation, not appearing to run from threats. The American people need to see strength and resolve from their leader, not an empty White House and a president who appears to be in hiding. Bush's frustration builds as he realizes that his preference to return home is being overruled by security considerations. Agent Marenzel receives continuous updates through his earpiece that reinforce the decision to recommend diversion. Intelligence reports from the Secret Service Intelligence Division describe Washington as potentially under siege. The Federal Aviation Administration reports that hijacked aircraft may still be heading toward the capital. The FBI warns of potential car bombs targeting government buildings. The cumulative threat assessment makes returning to Washington appear extremely risky. Karl Rove enters the cabin to support the president's position, arguing that political leadership requires visible presence in Washington. The administration cannot appear to be running from terrorists, especially when the vice president remains in the White House bunker coordinating government responses. Rove emphasizes that every minute Bush spends away from Washington sends a message of weakness to both the American people and potential enemies around the world. Agent Marenzel's perspective focuses on stark security realities rather than political considerations. Secret Service protocols prioritize the president's safety over his preference to return to Washington. The agents have access to threat intelligence that suggests the capital remains under active threat. Additional attacks appear possible, and the White House itself has received specific warnings that make the president's immediate return extremely dangerous. The 2025 declassified documents reveal the specific intelligence reports that convince Secret Service leadership to recommend diverting Air Force One away from Washington. At 10:32 a.m., the Secret Service Intelligence Division receives a report that 3 additional aircraft remain hijacked and may be targeting government buildings in the capital. 8 minutes later, another report suggests that car bombs may have been positioned near the White House and Capitol building. A third communication warns that surface-to-air missiles might have been smuggled into the Washington area. These threat assessments prove largely inaccurate, but the Secret Service agents cannot know that in real time. Their training emphasizes worst-case scenario planning, and the intelligence picture suggests that Washington has become the primary target for a coordinated terrorist campaign. From their perspective, flying the president directly into this threat environment would violate every principle of executive protection. Colonel Mark Tillman receives updated flight instructions as the security assessment continues. The original flight plan called for a direct return to Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington. However, the Secret Service recommendation suggests diverting to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where the president can safely address the nation while remaining protected from potential additional attacks. The discussion continues as Air Force One flies northeast toward what was supposed to be Washington. Bush expresses his frustration with security restrictions that prevent him from returning to the White House during a national crisis. The president's concerns focus not just on the immediate situation, but on the broader implications of allowing security considerations to override presidential preferences during emergencies. At 11:48 a.m., the decision becomes final. Air Force One will divert to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana rather than continue to Washington. The president reluctantly agrees to this security recommendation while demanding that threat assessments be continuously updated. Bush insists that Air Force One return to Washington as soon as security conditions permit, treating the diversion as a temporary measure rather than a permanent retreat from the capital. The compromise reflects the unprecedented nature of the security situation. Secret Service protocols designed to protect the president have never been tested against coordinated attacks on American soil. The agent's recommendation to avoid Washington, while frustrating to the president, follows established procedures that prioritize executive safety above all other considerations, including presidential preferences. Colonel Tillman adjusts Air Force One's heading southwest toward Louisiana, beginning an unexpected journey to a military installation that few aboard the aircraft have ever visited. The diversion represents more than a change in flight plans. It demonstrates how the September 11th attacks have fundamentally altered standard presidential travel procedures, forcing real-time adaptations to unprecedented security threats. As Air Force One banks toward its new destination, The crew remains unaware that their most terrifying moment still lies ahead. The aircraft carries the president away from Washington's uncertain dangers, but the flight itself is about to become the target of a threat that will shake everyone aboard to their core. The White House switchboard receives a phone call that sends shockwaves through the entire government security apparatus. The caller delivers a brief, chilling message that will haunt everyone aboard Air Force One for the remainder of the flight. Angel is next. The voice says before the line goes dead. The use of this specific word transforms what might have been dismissed as a prank call into the most terrifying threat of the day. Angel is the classified code name for Air Force One, known only to a select group of government officials and security personnel. The implications of this threat hit the Secret Service like a physical blow. Someone with access to highly classified information has just announced their intention to target the presidential aircraft. Within the tightly controlled world of presidential security, code names represent the ultimate layer of operational secrecy. The fact that an unknown caller possesses this information suggests either a catastrophic security breach or the presence of an insider threat within the government itself. Agent Eddie Marenzel receives the threat report through his secure communication channel and immediately implements the highest level of defensive protocols. The message travels from the White House Situation Room through encrypted channels to Air Force One's communications center, where Technical Sergeant Thomas Gould relays the information to the Secret Service detail. The 3 words, "Angel is next," create an instant transformation aboard the aircraft as agents shift from protective mode to combat readiness. The response aboard Air Force One is swift and comprehensive. Agent Carl Truscott positions himself directly outside the cockpit door, his hand resting on his weapon as he scans every face that passes through the narrow corridor. Other agents spread throughout the passenger compartments, abandoning their normal positions to create overlapping fields of observation. The presidential cabin becomes a fortress within a fortress as additional agents establish a protective perimeter around President Bush. Staff members throughout Air Force One notice the sudden change in security posture. Press Secretary Ari Fleischer continues taking his handwritten notes, but observes agents positioned in locations where he has never seen them before. Deputy Chief of Staff Josh Bolton finds his movements subtly restricted as agents create new barriers and checkpoints throughout the aircraft. The message becomes clear without words. Someone aboard this plane might be a traitor. The psychological impact of the threat extends beyond immediate security concerns to create an atmosphere of suspicion and paranoia. Senior staff members who have worked together for months suddenly view each other with new scrutiny. Communications specialists monitoring radio traffic wonder if their conversations are being overheard by hostile forces. Even the flight crew faces questioning looks from Secret Service agents who must now consider every person aboard as a potential threat. Colonel Mark Tillman receives instructions to implement additional flight security measures based on the Angel threat. The aircraft's communication protocols shift to include new encryption procedures and frequency changes designed to prevent hostile forces from tracking Air Force One's position. Navigation procedures become more complex as Tillman executes random course corrections to make the aircraft's flight path unpredictable to anyone monitoring from the ground. The investigation capabilities available in 2001 cannot quickly verify or dismiss the Angel threat, leaving everyone aboard to assume the worst-case scenario. Phone call tracing technology requires significant time to produce results, and the overwhelming volume of communications during the crisis makes rapid analysis nearly impossible. The Secret Service must operate under the assumption that the threat is credible while hoping that subsequent investigation will prove otherwise. Communications security becomes paramount as agents realize that someone with access to classified code, names, might also possess other sensitive information about Air Force One's operations. Radio procedures shift to include additional authentication requirements for all incoming transmissions. Ground-based communications must now pass through enhanced verification procedures before reaching the aircraft, creating delays, but improving security against potential deception operations. Hours pass without resolution, As the investigation into the Angel threat continues, the uncertainty proves almost as damaging as confirmation would have been, creating sustained psychological pressure on everyone involved in presidential protection. Secret Service agents maintain heightened alertness for the remainder of the flight, their nerves stretched by the constant possibility that someone nearby poses a direct threat to the president. The 2025 investigation updates reveal that the Angel threat likely originated from miscommunication and misunderstood phone conversations during the chaos of September 11th. The declassified 9/11 Commission report findings confirm that the warning was likely a miscommunication rather than a credible insider threat. Multiple government agencies were coordinating through overloaded communication systems, creating opportunities for misinterpreted messages and garbled transmissions. The specific phrase, "Angel is next," may have resulted from fragmented conversations between security personnel discussing Air Force One's movement schedule. Modern communication security protocols implemented since 2001 would have quickly identified and resolved the Angel threat through automated verification systems. Current technology includes real-time authentication for all communications involving presidential security, making false threats easier to identify and dismiss. Advanced encryption and secure communication networks prevent the type of miscommunication that created such dangerous uncertainty aboard Air Force One. The broader implications of the Angel threat extend beyond immediate security concerns to highlight fundamental vulnerabilities in government communication systems. The incident demonstrates how false information can be as disruptive as real threats during national emergencies. The psychological impact on decision-makers and security personnel creates lasting effects that influence behavior long after the initial threat has been resolved. For the remainder of the flight, everyone aboard Air Force One operates under the assumption that they are being hunted by someone with intimate knowledge of their operations. This sustained tension affects every decision and interaction for hours to come. While hundreds of miles away in Washington, government officials face an even more harrowing decision that will test the very foundations of American democracy: the Shootdown Authorization controversy. At 10:12 a.m., Vice President Dick Cheney sits in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center beneath the White House, surrounded by military advisors and intelligence analysts. Reports continue flooding in about additional hijacked aircraft heading toward Washington. The Pentagon has been struck. The White House remains a potential target. Cheney faces a decision that no vice president has ever confronted: whether to authorize the military to shoot down civilian aircraft carrying innocent American passengers. The constitutional framework governing such decisions was designed for scenarios involving foreign military threats, not domestic commercial aircraft turned into weapons by terrorists. The vice president does not hold a position in the military chain of command, which traditionally runs from the president as commander-in-chief through the Secretary of Defense to military commanders. However, with President Bush aboard Air Force One and communication links unreliable, Cheney must act on incomplete information while potential threats approach the Capitol. Intelligence reports suggest that multiple hijacked aircraft remain airborne and may be targeting government facilities in Washington. Military commanders need immediate authorization to intercept and potentially destroy these aircraft before they can reach their targets. The window for decision-making shrinks with each passing minute as radar contacts move closer to the capital region. Cheney weighs the unthinkable choice between allowing potential attacks to succeed or ordering the destruction of aircraft that may contain hundreds of innocent passengers. The authorization emerges from this pressure cooker environment between 10:12 and 10:18 a.m. as Cheney consults with Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and other senior officials. The vice president issues the order for military aircraft to engage hijacked planes that pose threats to government facilities. The decision carries enormous moral weight. Cheney has just authorized the potential killing of American civilians to prevent larger-scale attacks on government targets. Military personnel receive these orders with profound unease. Fighter pilots, trained to protect American airspace, now face the possibility of firing missiles at civilian aircraft. Air Force commanders struggle with rules of engagement that require them to assess hostile intent from commercial airliners. The psychological burden on pilots who might have to execute such orders creates unprecedented stress within the military chain of command. Technical Sergeant Thomas Gould aboard Air Force One receives fragmented communications about the shootdown authorization through overloaded communication networks. The initial reports reaching the presidential aircraft lack crucial details about the scope and limitations of the order. Gould attempts to establish clear communication with the White House bunker to confirm the authorization, but static and interference make verification nearly impossible. President Bush learns about the shootdown order through partial communications that raise more questions than they answer. The president demands immediate clarification from Vice President Cheney about the authorization and its constitutional implications. Bush recognizes that such orders must come from him as commander-in-chief, but the communication difficulties make real-time coordination between Air Force One and the White House bunker extremely challenging. The phone call between Cheney and Bush lasts 2 minutes, according to investigation reports, but the conversation proves frustratingly incomplete due to communication system failures. Bush struggles to hear Cheney's explanations over static and interference. The president attempts to provide clear guidance about the shootdown authorization. But both men recognize that the communication links may fail again at any moment, leaving military commanders without definitive orders. Air Force commanders monitoring radar screens track unidentified aircraft contacts approaching Washington while waiting for clear authorization to engage. The rules of engagement require positive identification of hostile intent before firing weapons, but hijacked aircraft appear identical to normal commercial flights on radar screens. Pilots must make split-second decisions about whether approaching aircraft pose genuine threats or represent false alarms. The constitutional crisis deepens as legal experts within the government recognize that the shootdown authorization raises fundamental questions about executive authority during national emergencies. The existing framework provides no clear guidance for situations where the vice president must act independently while the president remains unavailable. The 2025 legal analysis reveals how this situation highlighted critical gaps in emergency command authority that required immediate attention. Fighter aircraft scramble from multiple air bases to establish defensive perimeters around Washington, but their pilots receive conflicting information about the authorization to engage civilian aircraft. Some commanders interpret the orders broadly, while others demand more specific guidance before taking action. The communication breakdown prevents military personnel from receiving consistent direction about when and how to implement the shootdown authorization. The moral complexity of the situation weighs heavily on everyone involved in the decision-making process. Military commanders must balance their duty to protect government facilities against the horrific prospect of destroying aircraft filled with innocent passengers. The authorization represents a lose-lose scenario where any action or inaction could result in massive loss of life. Modern 2025 emergency command protocols address the constitutional and operational problems exposed by the shootdown authorization controversy. Current procedures establish clear lines of succession and decision-making authority during national emergencies. The protocols specify exactly who can authorize military action when the president is unavailable and create redundant communication systems to prevent the type of confusion that characterized September 11th. The streamlined command structure implemented since 2001 eliminates ambiguity about authorization procedures during crisis situations. Military commanders now receive clear, written orders through secure communication channels that cannot be misinterpreted or corrupted by technical failures. The new protocols ensure that constitutional authority remains clearly defined even when normal government operations are disrupted. The tragic irony underlying the entire shootdown authorization controversy becomes clear only after the fact. United Airlines Flight 93, the aircraft that prompted Cheney's order, had already crashed in Pennsylvania before the authorization could be fully implemented. The passengers who fought back against the hijackers prevented the aircraft from reaching its intended target, making the agonizing decision about shooting down civilian aircraft ultimately unnecessary. As these constitutional and military crises unfold in Washington, Air Force One continues its journey toward what will become an even more extraordinary destination, a classified military installation where the president will direct the nation's response from deep beneath the earth. The Underground Command Center. At 1:27 p.m., Air Force One touches down at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, its landing gear making contact with a runway that serves one of America's most classified military installations. The base houses the headquarters of United States Strategic Command, the military organization responsible for coordinating nuclear weapons and global strike capabilities. President Bush steps off the aircraft onto a tarmac surrounded by armed security personnel who have been waiting for his arrival since receiving word of the diversion an hour earlier. The presidential motorcade forms quickly and moves across the base toward a nondescript concrete building that conceals one of the most sophisticated command centers in the world. The structure appears unremarkable from the surface, but beneath its foundation lies a facility designed to survive direct nuclear attacks and coordinate military responses during global conflicts. The building's entrance provides no indication of the advanced technology housed 40 feet below ground level. Secret Service agents escort President Bush through multiple security checkpoints as they descend into the Stratcom underground bunker. Each level requires additional authentication and clearance verification before access is granted to deeper sections of the facility. The descent takes several minutes as elevators carry the presidential party through reinforced concrete and steel barriers designed to protect against electromagnetic pulses and radiation exposure. The main command center spreads across multiple rooms connected by corridors lined with communication equipment and monitoring stations. Banks of computers display real-time intelligence feeds from around the world while technicians coordinate with military installations across the United States. The facility operates as a self-contained government installation with independent power generation, air filtration systems, and communication networks that function regardless of conditions on the surface. President Bush enters the primary briefing room where military commanders present updated intelligence about the continuing crisis. Large display screens show aircraft movements across American airspace, while other monitors track government responses to the attacks. The room contains secure communication terminals that provide direct connections to the Pentagon, White House Situation Room, and military command centers worldwide. These systems offer capabilities that were not available aboard Air Force One during the morning's flight. Bush reviewed global alerts in the Underground Command Center designed to withstand nuclear attack. The bunker's communication infrastructure includes redundant satellite links and hardened transmission equipment that maintain connectivity even during extreme electromagnetic interference. Multiple backup systems ensure that critical government communications continue functioning regardless of attacks on surface facilities. The technology available in the underground facility represents decades of investment in survivable command and control capabilities designed for the most severe national emergencies. Staff members spread throughout the bunker's various operational areas as they coordinate the national response from deep underground. Press Secretary Ari Fleischer continues documenting events in his handwritten notes while observing the surreal environment of running a government from a military bunker. Deputy Chief of Staff Josh Bolton coordinates with White House personnel who remain in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center beneath the West Wing. The psychological impact of governing from an underground military facility becomes apparent as the afternoon progresses. President Bush recognizes the symbolic importance of visible leadership during national crises, but security requirements keep him physically separated from the American people during their darkest hour. The bunker provides absolute protection, but creates an emotional distance between the president and the citizens he serves. Military personnel throughout the facility maintain heightened alert status as intelligence reports continue suggesting additional attacks may be planned. The command center receives threat assessments from multiple agencies while coordinating defensive measures for government installations nationwide. The uncertainty about ongoing threats creates sustained tension among decision-makers who must respond to incomplete and sometimes contradictory information. The Stratcom bunker includes residential areas with bedrooms and dining facilities designed to support extended operations during prolonged crises. These accommodations would allow the facility to function as an overnight command center if circumstances required extended stays underground. The self-contained nature of the installation enables continuous operations regardless of external conditions or threats to surface facilities. Communication sessions with congressional leaders and cabinet members occur through secure video conferences that connect the underground facility with government officials across Washington. The bunker's advanced telecommunications equipment provides clear audio and video connections despite the challenges created by operating from deep underground. These capabilities allow President Bush to maintain coordination with key decision-makers while remaining physically protected. Intelligence briefings reveal the ongoing challenges facing law, enforcement, and military personnel as they respond to the attacks. The FBI coordinates investigations across multiple states while the Federal Aviation Administration works to restore normal air traffic operations. The National Security Agency provides electronic intelligence about potential additional threats, while the Central Intelligence Agency assesses international implications of the morning's events. The underground facility demonstrates both the strengths and limitations of fixed command installations during national emergencies. While the bunker provides unparalleled protection and communication capabilities, its location in Nebraska creates physical and psychological separation between leadership and the American people. This distance becomes particularly problematic during crises that require visible presidential presence and reassurance. The decision-making process within the bunker involves constant assessment of evolving threats and coordination with multiple government agencies. President Bush weighs security concerns against the political and symbolic importance of returning to Washington. The ongoing uncertainty about additional attacks creates pressure to remain in the protected environment while national leadership requirements demand visible presence in the Capitol. As afternoon turns to evening, discussions begin about the feasibility of returning to Washington despite continued security concerns. Air Force One sits on the tarmac above, while its crew prepares for another flight that will hopefully be the final leg of this unprecedented journey. The prospect of leaving the bunker's absolute security creates new anxiety among Secret Service agents who must balance protection requirements against presidential leadership needs. At 4:33 p.m., President Bush makes the difficult decision to leave the underground sanctuary and return to Air Force One for what everyone hopes will be the final flight of this historic day. However, the communication challenges that had plagued the presidential aircraft throughout the morning were far from resolved, and the most frustrating technical failures still lay ahead. At 10:18 a.m., Technical Sergeant Thomas Gould sits at his communication station aboard Air Force One, frantically cycling through radio frequencies as another secure voice link fails during a critical transmission from the White House. The high-frequency radio system that forms the backbone of Air Force One's communication network was designed during the Cold War for scenarios involving nuclear threats and foreign military adversaries. These systems perform adequately under normal conditions, but the unprecedented demands of September 11th exposed fundamental weaknesses that compromise coordination with ground-based leadership throughout the crisis. The secure telephone systems aboard Air Force One begin experiencing failures within minutes of takeoff from Sarasota. Deputy Chief of Staff Josh Bolton attempts to maintain contact with the White House Situation Room, but the connection cuts out repeatedly during conversations with Vice President Cheney. The normally reliable telephone lines become unreliable at precisely the moment when clear communication proves most essential. The 9/11 Commission report later documented how the phone outage during Cheney's call at 10:18 a.m. created dangerous delays in coordinating the government's response. Communications specialist Master Sergeant Paul Gibbs monitors multiple radio frequencies simultaneously while watching secure data links fail one after another. The aircraft's communication suite includes backup systems designed to maintain connectivity during equipment failures, but the volume of traffic overwhelming government networks creates cascading breakdowns that affect even redundant systems. Gibbs switches between primary and secondary channels every few minutes, but each frequency change requires time to re-establish connections and verify encryption protocols. The broader communication network across the United States faces unprecedented overload as millions of Americans attempt to contact family members and government agencies coordinate emergency responses. Cellular towers throughout the northeastern corridor reach capacity within hours of the attacks, creating busy signals for callers trying to reach emergency services. This overload affects government communication networks that share infrastructure with civilian systems, contributing to the delays and connection failures plaguing Air Force One's attempts to maintain contact with Washington. President Bush experiences the communication breakdown firsthand during attempts to coordinate with congressional leadership about the government's response. The president picks up the secure phone to speak with House Speaker Dennis Hastert, but the connection fails twice before they can complete their conversation. Bush's frustration grows as each failed call delays critical decisions about military responses and government operations. The communication failures create an atmosphere of isolation aboard Air Force, one as the president struggles to maintain coordination with key decision-makers on the ground. Staff members throughout the aircraft witness the mounting technical problems as communication specialists work frantically to maintain connections with ground-based agencies. Press Secretary Ari Fleischer documents the communication failures in his handwritten notes, observing repeated attempts to establish clear voice links with the Pentagon and White House. The normally efficient flow of information between Air Force One and government agencies degrades into fragmented conversations interrupted by static and dropped connections. The satellite communication systems aboard Air Force One provide backup connectivity when radio systems fail, but these links prove limited in scope and reliability during the crisis. The aircraft's satellite antenna requires precise positioning to maintain connections, but defensive maneuvering and altitude changes disrupt the signal alignment needed for consistent communication. Colonel Mark Tillman must choose between maintaining communication links and executing defensive flying procedures designed to protect against potential aerial threats. Intelligence updates from the FBI and CIA reach Air Force One through communication channels that experience significant delays due to network overload and system failures. Critical information about ongoing threats takes minutes or hours to reach the presidential aircraft instead of the seconds required for effective crisis management. These delays mean that decision-makers aboard Air Force One often operate with outdated intelligence that may no longer reflect the current threat environment. The communication breakdowns create dangerous misunderstandings between Air Force One and military commanders coordinating fighter escort operations. Fighter aircraft attempting to establish contact with the presidential aircraft receive conflicting radio frequencies and authentication codes due to communication system malfunctions. These coordination failures leave Air Force One temporarily without adequate military protection as pilots struggle to verify their identity and intentions through unreliable radio links. Encryption systems designed to protect sensitive communications add additional complexity to an already strained network. The time required to establish secure connections increases significantly when communication systems must restart encryption protocols after each failure. Technical personnel aboard Air Force One spend precious minutes re-establishing secure links that should maintain constant connectivity. These encryption delays compound the problems created by equipment failures and network overload. The extended flight time and multiple diversions of Air Force One result partly from communication failures that prevent real-time coordination of security assessments and threat analysis. Without reliable intelligence updates, Secret Service agents must assume worst-case scenarios when making decisions about presidential movements and aircraft routing. These conservative security measures extend the president's time away from Washington while communication specialists continue struggling to re-establish reliable contact with ground-based leadership. Modern satellite communication systems deployed on current Air Force One aircraft provide multiple redundant channels that eliminate many of the vulnerabilities experienced in 2001. Advanced encryption protocols establish secure connections within seconds rather than minutes, while automated switching between satellite networks maintains connectivity regardless of aircraft position or atmospheric conditions. These improvements ensure reliable communication during defensive maneuvering and extreme altitude operations. The communication infrastructure improvements implemented since 2001 include dedicated government communication satellites that separate presidential communications from civilian networks prone to overload during national emergencies. Enhanced ground-based relay stations provide additional backup connectivity when primary satellite links experience interference. Multiple redundant systems ensure that communication failures cannot isolate the president from ground-based leadership during crisis situations. The lessons learned from September 11th communication failures emphasize that reliable communication infrastructure proves as critical as physical security measures during national crises. As evening approached and security assessments finally began showing improvement, the technical challenges that had plagued Air Force One throughout the day created one final obstacle to overcome before the president could return home. The long journey home. At 6:22 p.m., Air Force One receives the clearance everyone aboard has been waiting for since morning. The White House Situation Room transmits authorization for the presidential aircraft to return to Washington after more than 12 hours of uncertainty and multiple diversions. Colonel Mark Tillman acknowledges the clearance with relief evident in his voice, but the mood aboard the aircraft remains cautious. The day's events have taught everyone that circumstances can change rapidly and security threats can emerge without warning. Secret Service agents maintain their heightened alert status throughout the return flight, positioning themselves strategically throughout the aircraft's compartments. Agent Eddie Marenzel continues monitoring radio communications for any new threat intelligence, while his team remains prepared for immediate defensive action. The agents have learned that normal procedures no longer apply, and they treat every mile of the flight back to Washington as potentially dangerous territory where new threats could materialize at any moment. Technical Sergeant Thomas Gould works continuously to maintain secure communication links with ground control as Air Force One begins its journey toward the capital. The communication challenges that plague the aircraft throughout the day persist during the return flight, forcing Gould to cycle through multiple frequencies and backup systems. Each successful connection provides temporary relief, but the crew remains aware that reliable communication cannot be guaranteed until they reach familiar airspace near Washington. President Bush spends the return flight preparing for what may be the most important address of his presidency. The president must find words to comfort a traumatized nation while projecting strength and resolve in the face of unprecedented attacks on American soil. Staff members assist with drafting remarks for the Oval Office address, but the weight of the day's events makes every word choice critical. Bush recognizes that the American people need reassurance that their government remains strong and capable of protecting them. The extended absence from Washington creates significant challenges for public perception and national morale. Television. Coverage throughout the day repeatedly shows images of the empty White House and speculation about the president's whereabouts. The physical separation between President Bush and key decision-makers in Washington created coordination difficulties that influenced policy decisions during the critical first hours after the attacks. Press Secretary Ari Fleischer continues documenting events in his handwritten notes as Air Force One approaches familiar airspace over Virginia. Fleischer observes the mixture of relief and anxiety among staff members as they prepare for the final approach to Andrews Air Force Base. The return flight represents both an ending to the day's extraordinary journey and the beginning of a new chapter in American history that will require sustained leadership and national unity. The aircraft's approach to Washington reveals a transformed landscape below. Military aircraft patrol the skies around the Capitol, while enhanced security measures remain visible at government facilities throughout the region. The normal air traffic patterns have been disrupted by continued restrictions on civilian flights, creating an eerie emptiness in airspace that would typically be filled with commercial aircraft. This visual reminder of the day's attacks reinforces the magnitude of changes that have occurred in American society. Fighter escorts accompany Air Force One during the final approach to Andrews Air Force Base, providing armed protection that was absent during the morning's departure from Sarasota. The F-16 aircraft maintain formation around the presidential plane as Colonel Tillman executes the landing approach. The presence of military escorts serves as both a security measure and a symbol of the new reality facing presidential travel in a post-September 11th world. Air Force One touches down at Andrews Air Force Base at 6:54 p.m., ending the longest presidential flight in modern history. The Boeing 747 has traveled thousands of miles across the United States while carrying the weight of national leadership during America's darkest day. Ground crews and security personnel position themselves around the aircraft as it taxis to the designated parking area, their movements reflecting the continued high alert status throughout government facilities. The transfer to Marine One for the final segment to the White House occurs under extraordinary security measures that exceed normal presidential movement protocols. Multiple helicopters participate in the transfer operation, while additional aircraft provide aerial security coverage. The short flight from Andrews Air Force Base to the White House normally takes less than 10 minutes, but security considerations extend the time required for coordination and execution. Washington's skyline appears different from the air as Marine One approaches the White House. Enhanced security measures create visible changes in the Capitol's normal operations, while emergency response vehicles remain positioned throughout the government district. The city that President Bush left 12 hours earlier has been transformed by the day's events into a fortress-like environment where security concerns override normal civic operations. Marine One lands on the south lawn of the White House at 7:12 p.m., completing President Bush's extraordinary journey home. The helicopter's rotor blades slow as Secret Service agents prepare for the final transfer to the executive mansion. Bush steps onto the familiar grounds of the White House after an absence that felt much longer than the 12 hours that actually elapsed since his departure for Florida that morning. The president walks across the South Lawn toward the Oval Office, where he will address the nation in less than 2 hours. The man who left the White House that morning to promote education initiatives returns as a wartime president facing challenges that will define his administration and reshape American foreign policy for decades. The day's events aboard Air Force One have demonstrated both the vulnerabilities and resilience of American democracy while establishing new precedents for crisis management. The 13 hours in the sky had exposed critical weaknesses in presidential security protocols that demanded immediate attention. September 11th spurred comprehensive modernization of communication systems, escort procedures, and crisis management protocols that continue protecting presidential security today. The failures and successes of that extraordinary day would reshape every aspect of how America protects its leaders during national emergencies. Lessons written in sky. The comprehensive review that followed September 11th transformed every aspect of presidential security protocols, beginning with the communication systems that failed so catastrophically during those 13 hours in the sky. The unreliable telephone lines that plagued Air Force One throughout the crisis were completely replaced with advanced satellite. Communication networks that maintain constant connectivity regardless of altitude or atmospheric conditions. Technical Sergeant Thomas Gould's struggles with static-filled radio transmissions became the foundation for implementing redundant communication channels that ensure presidential contact with ground-based leadership never fails again. Modern Air Force One aircraft carry communication equipment that would have eliminated the dangerous isolation experienced during the September 11th flight. Multiple satellite systems provide overlapping coverage across global flight paths, while encrypted digital networks prevent the type of interference that disrupted critical conversations between President Bush and Vice President Cheney. These upgrades address the specific vulnerabilities exposed when communication failures contributed to extended flight times and dangerous decision-making delays during the crisis. Fighter escort procedures received equally comprehensive overhauls following the morning when Air Force One flew alone through potentially hostile airspace for nearly 30 minutes. Current protocols automatically deploy military aircraft to accompany the presidential plane during any national emergency, eliminating the dangerous window that existed before F-16s from the Florida Air National Guard finally appeared on the horizon. The sight of those fighter jets provided the first sense of security since takeoff, demonstrating how critical armed escorts prove during aerial threats. The escort coordination improvements extend beyond simple aircraft deployment to include enhanced communication protocols between fighter pilots and Air Force One crews. Colonel Mark Tillman's challenges in coordinating with military aircraft through unreliable radio systems led to dedicated communication channels that maintain constant contact between escort fighters and the presidential aircraft. These systems prevent the coordination failures that left Air Force One temporarily without adequate military protection as pilots struggled to verify their identity through malfunctioning radio links. Threat assessment capabilities underwent fundamental transformation as intelligence agencies recognized how false information proved as disruptive as real threats during the crisis. The Angel is next, warning that terrorized everyone aboard Air Force One for hours would now be resolved within minutes through automated verification systems and real-time threat analysis. Modern threat verification protocols process incoming intelligence from multiple sources simultaneously while providing immediate credibility assessments that prevent the paranoia and confusion that gripped the aircraft when someone used the classified code name for Air Force One. Intelligence sharing improvements include dedicated government communication satellites that separate presidential communications from civilian networks prone to overload during national emergencies. The communication breakdowns that isolated Air Force One from critical intelligence updates now seem impossible given the redundant systems and enhanced data processing capabilities available today. Real-time intelligence feeds update automatically without requiring manual intervention from communication specialists who previously spent precious minutes re-establishing connections after each system failure. The aircraft itself has been transformed into a more capable mobile command center with technology that addresses every limitation exposed during September 11th. Enhanced defensive systems provide protection against a broader range of aerial threats, while improved navigation equipment enables more sophisticated evasive maneuvering without losing communication connectivity. The underground bunker at Offutt Air Force Base that served as a temporary seat of government demonstrated the importance of mobile command capabilities, leading to upgrades that make Air Force One a more effective flying White House. Crisis management protocols now emphasize maintaining continuous presidential presence in Washington whenever possible while providing enhanced mobile command capabilities when travel becomes necessary. The 12-hour absence that undermined public confidence has been addressed through procedures that minimize separation time while maintaining adequate protection levels. Modern emergency response frameworks include predetermined procedures for maintaining government continuity without requiring extended presidential flights to secure locations in distant states. The psychological impact on presidential travel extends beyond technical improvements to address the human cost of enhanced security measures. Secret Service agents who experience the unprecedented stress of potentially protecting against insider threats now receive additional training and psychological support to manage similar crisis situations. The sustained paranoia that affected everyone aboard Air Force One when the Angel threat suggested a potential traitor among them highlighted the need for better mental health resources during extended crisis operations. Security planning improvements balance protection requirements with the democratic need for accessible leadership during national crises. The constitutional crisis created when Secret Service agents overruled direct presidential orders led to clarified protocols that define decision-making authority during national emergencies. Modern procedures eliminate ambiguity about who can authorize security measures while maintaining presidential authority, over government operations and policy decisions. The technological advances implemented since 2001 include enhanced encryption protocols that establish secure connections within seconds rather than minutes, eliminating the delays that hampered coordination between Air Force One and ground-based agencies. Automated switching between satellite networks maintains connectivity regardless of aircraft position, while advanced threat detection systems provide early warning about potential aerial attacks. These improvements ensure that communication failures cannot isolate the president from ground-based leadership during future crisis situations. The broader influence on crisis management extends across government agencies that learned from the coordination failures and communication breakdowns experienced during September 11th. Enhanced interagency communication networks prevent the conflicting intelligence reports that created dangerous uncertainty about additional threats throughout the day. Modern protocols ensure that all agencies operate with consistent information while maintaining the flexibility needed to respond to rapidly evolving situations. The human elements of presidential security received equal attention as technical improvements, recognizing that the psychological pressure on decision-makers proves as important as equipment capabilities. Training programs now prepare Secret Service agents and military personnel for the moral complexity of crisis situations while providing support resources to help them process the emotional impact of their responsibilities. The agents who faced unprecedented decisions about overruling presidential orders now serve as instructors for current personnel facing similar challenges. These comprehensive improvements represent more than technical upgrades or procedural changes. They reflect fundamental questions about how democracy functions when its leaders face existential threats, and whether the measures necessary to protect those leaders might ultimately change the very nature of democratic governance itself. The transformation of presidential security following that extraordinary day reshaped how America protects its leaders during national emergencies. Those 13 hours in the sky created a new reality for presidential security that extends far beyond Air Force One itself. The communication failures, threat assessments, and constitutional crises experienced during September 11th established protocols that continue protecting American democracy today. Every subsequent president benefits from lessons written in hostile skies above a nation under attack. The balance between security and accessibility remains delicate. Enhanced protection measures enable effective leadership during crises, but they also create distance between presidents and citizens. The events of September 11th proved that vulnerability and strength often coexist, requiring constant vigilance without sacrificing democratic principles that define America.